Okay, so I'll jump straight in. Just first to say a special thanks to Transcending Taboo Conference and you guys at Holloway as well for inviting me to speak to you today. This is a special day in that it's 420, the significance of which I'll explain in a moment. And I'm going to be talking about cannabis legalization and evidence-based policy making and how we can put the we in weed. So to introduce myself and the group that I work for the Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group. We formed in May 2019. So we are a relatively new group to the space of drug policy reform. What makes our group a little bit different is the fact that our chairman is actually a Conservative MP, so Crispin Blunt. He's also the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for drug policy reform, alongside other MPs like Labour MP Jeff Smith, and he was actually the first Conservative MP to be the co-chair of that group. He was also former prisons minister, which is where Crispin started to get the sense that our approach to drug policy and drug control wasn't working, and if anything kind of seemed slightly pointless and making things worse. And that's a big part of the reason, which is why he set up the CDPRG. To kind of use Crispin's words, he wanted to drag the topic of drug policy reform into the centre right of politics, which is what the Conservative part of our name indicates. So we're not formally part of the Conservative Party, and the members that it's built up of, so myself and others, we're from different political ideologies and backgrounds, but our title reflects our focus on the centre right of politics and framing our debates in that manner. You may have seen sort of recently Labour leader Keir Starmer sadly and effectively kind of shut down a sensible debate on drug policy reform, used the usual sort of tough on crime approach. And it is often said that Labour are sort of resistant to budge unless the right does it first. So if we want to see reform in drug policy generally, we do need to get the two top parties to at least be having a serious conversation about it. It's very important we convince them to the merits of reform and the risks if they do nothing as well and just persist and maintain the status quo. As an organisation, we believe that drug policy should be evidence-based. And to do that, we assemble and present evidence from across all spectrums in society of governance. So we've got our expert policy council here on the right. We've got people who are prescribers of cannabis medicines, some in the UK, some overseas, some have done both. We've got people who are have backgrounds in law enforcement, policing, economic specialists, ethics, criminology, human rights as well. And general law, because drug policy does intersect with a wide range of those different disciplines. So we draw on all of those expertise. Our chairman and our policy council are unremunerated, so that means that they basically lend their expertise to us for free. There's no incentive apart from trying to drive evidence-based drug policy forward. And we produce a range of sort of drug-related policy reports, and when we use those to engage not only with ministers on the centre right of government, but also the media as well, and hopefully stimulate some informed and useful debate. So what is 420, which is today? So 4 is the month, which is April, and 20 is the date of the month, so the 4th of the 20th. So that's the American way of saying it, which kind of suggests that 420 has come from the States and is more kind of an American celebration of all things cannabis. I don't think anyone's quite sure where it came from. The most sort of convincing story seems to be that it was a group of students in the 1970s who always went off to smoke cannabis at around 420 after they'd finished sports. So the term 420 became synonymous with smoking cannabis, and actually also recognised as a good time to smoke cannabis as well. So today, obviously, COVID might have changed things, but this is when you'd see lots of people going to Hyde Park, blatantly sort of smoking cannabis in front of law enforcement who trying not to get involved because it's quite uncomfortable for them, and kind of in a slight way makes a mockery of our drug laws, particularly those pertaining to cannabis, and particularly when you have so many people out on the field kind of all exercising their right to use it. So that's part of the reason why we're discussing cannabis legalization today. And before I get into it, I think it is useful to give a quick introduction to the cannabis plant. So it's a flowering plant and it has many different uses, from textiles and building materials, but its most controversial use is its use as a drug or as an intoxicant, which people use recreationally. So that might be for fun, it could be to relax, maybe even for therapeutic purposes as well. But it is what we call a controlled drug under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, where it is in Class B. Some of you may remember it had a brief stint in Class C, and then it went up to Class B again, and that's the kind of the only movement that we've had, sadly. But despite the fact that it's a controlled drug, and you can be arrested potentially or get in trouble with the law for taking it, it is actually the most popular controlled drug pretty much worldwide. So the most popular drugs would be alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine, but then it's shortly followed by cannabis, despite the fact that it is controlled and unlawful. Like any drug, it can deliver positive effects and negative effects, which may vary depending on how it's used, frequency of use, and who's using it. We know risks of negative effects are kind of higher if you're a younger user or you smoke it frequently or in high doses, or especially among those who might have existing mental health conditions or undiagnosed mental health issues. So its effects can vary greatly depending on the individual characteristics of the cannabis consumed as well. So we now know that there are over 700 plant chemicals that have been found and identified within the cannabis plant. Phytocannabinoids are the group that have been the most studied so far for their effects on human health, of which 120 have been identified. The most commonly known are THC and CBD, and that's because these have been the most researched. Before 1964 and the isolation of THC, it was unknown what caused the effects of cannabis. And this led in turn to this discovery of this entirely new class of drugs known as phytocannabinoids. THC is the main psychoactive ingredient, so that's what's responsible for those feelings of feeling high. But like any botanical product, there is this interplay of the many different compounds within it. So CBD, for example, the other phytocannabinoid that we know a bit about, has been shown to help with anxiety, depression, and seizures. We have licensed CBD drugs now for treatment of a few conditions. CBD itself in isolation is not a controlled compound, but THC is. And in compliance with international law, the whole cannabis plant is controlled under domestic legislation. So what that means is that if you want to grow cannabis, even if you're just trying to cultivate the CBD alone, you need a license from the government to do so, and they are quite tricky to get. And also what's quite difficult is the government/Home Office take the view that, which is not entirely incorrect, that it's very difficult to isolate any compounds from the cannabis plant, i.e. sort of CBD, from THC, even if it's a very small trace amount. So that's why the CBD industry is a bit complicated at the moment, because technically all of those products are deemed unlawful, but it's just not being enforced at the moment. So this diversity of compounds within the cannabis plant makes it really difficult to study and research. And what was also frustrating about the Misuse of Drugs Act and the Misuse of Drugs Regulations 2001 is that it was in Schedule 1, and any controlled drugs in Schedule 1 become much more difficult to research. It not only hinders research by making it more complicated, it really increases the cost as well, because you have to comply with all these Schedule 1 regulations. that it actually really inhibits our understanding and research of the drug coming out in the first place. So thankfully, cannabis was rescheduled to Schedule 2 in 2018, which means that a bit more of that evidence is coming to light now, and we're understanding a lot more about this plant. But really, policy is trying to catch up with the science at the moment. So we're in a very interesting space. It's also exciting and also highly frustrating at the same time for those of us that work in it. And just to summarize, so cannabis isn't one thing. It's not one product. It's not one medicine. It very much depends on the makeup and ratios of the different components within it. And we're not even entirely certain what all of those components do or in the different ratios. So there's a little bit of sort of feeling around in the dark here. And just on the right here, for anyone who's more interested in kind of the science behind cannabis, I highly recommend the Canna Manual by Christopher Tasker. If you're interested in sort of medicinal purposes and CBD and things like that, we've got this great book, the CBD Bible, and my group wrote a very extensive report about medical cannabis in the UK, if anyone wants to check that out. So what do we mean by legalisation? And I'll start off by explaining the status quo in the UK at the moment, which is prohibition. So that means that non-medical use of a controlled drug such as cannabis is unlawful. So that means that you risk arrest, criminal penalties if you're caught in possession of cannabis, or worse, if you're cultivating or supplying cannabis. So the reason why we say it's prohibition of cannabis for non-medical purposes is because there is a legally regulated route of access to cannabis via the legitimate medical route. However, this is extremely restricted at present. You've probably seen news and articles saying that even kids with life-threatening epilepsy can't get access to the types of cannabis medicines that they want and need. And even if you are prescribed a cannabis medicine, you have to use it as intended. So you can't be prescribed cannabis medicines and then decide to grow your own or access another cannabis product. You have to be using that particular route. So it's a very, very narrow route, and it's quite new as well. And another issue is because these cannabis medicines are quite new, they're also very expensive. So it's quite difficult to justify mass prescribing of them on the NHS, who obviously have to be very cost effective in the way that they do things. There's also another route, which is the CBD wellness route, which I mentioned briefly. So what I mean by that is you can access a CBD through going into Holland and Barrett and buying a CBD product. It's not strictly prohibited, but it's not quite lawful either. So it's in a bit of a weird grey area, but that is changing as we speak. So there are these kind of two routes, but essentially, the cannabis plant for recreational purposes, whatever you deem those to be, is unlawful. The policy of cannabis prohibition, more than prohibition for any other controlled drugs, is very patchy and open to criticism. So the foundational evidence, the actual evidence that in theory supported the placement of cannabis into the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, actually seems to be missing, or it's been archived. No one really seems to know where it is, so we can't even actually sort of challenge it. Some suggest that it probably never existed. And even if it does, it's probably grossly outdated given the recent developments in our scientific understanding of cannabis. So it's quite hard to think of, what are the pros of prohibition, but proponents of it would say, well, by reducing the supply of controlled drugs, stopping them coming into the country and stopping them being produced in the country and putting people off from using them will therefore prevent their use and the adverse effects that might be associated with them. And the government often, feels that prohibition sends a very clear message, and that is that all drugs are bad, don't do them. And when, we often try and present forms of drug policy reform to government, they're also always very fearful of sending the wrong message. So on the flip side of that, prohibition is a very clear and straight message. I would say it's actually more damaging because the complete lack of nuance means that people just largely ignore it. And the other big problem with prohibition is that it doesn't really seem to work. You know, cannabis in particular is easily accessible for anyone who wants to get hold of it. It's, as I said before, it's the most commonly used controlled drug worldwide. But there's also lots of other problems with it as well. Prohibition and the kind of focus on criminalisation, policing and enforcement has actually made drug markets more violent, and these laws are not equally distributed in society. So the majority of stop and searches for drugs, are for drugs, usually cannabis. And drug offences have repeatedly shown to be more among drug offences are one of the main drivers of racial disparities within Britain's criminal justice system. So Black and Asian drug offenders are far more likely to receive a custodial sentence when convicted than white offenders. And this is despite the fact that there's lots of other surveys that show that actually white people are more likely to use drugs than their Black and Asian counterparts. So drug laws and drug policy have unfortunately been used to kind of over police some communities more than others, and that's just to name a few of some of the issues with prohibition. And I would suggest, if you're interested in learning more about this, check out the books from Neil Woods. They're absolutely brilliant and really go into the detail of the drugs war, and also the Colour of Injustice report by Release. So then we have two alternatives to prohibition and criminalisation, effectively. So the first one in blue in the middle here is depenalisation, diversion and decriminalisation, 3 words broadly describing the same thing or examples of. And then we have legal regulation in green there on the right, and the two should not be confused as the same thing. The two are frequently blurred in the media and even in political debates, which is quite disheartening when you're trying to have a sensible debate. It's quite frustrating when even politicians in the media think that you're talking about the same thing when they're very, very separate. So decriminalisation is a process of replacing a criminal penalty for a crime with something that's a lesser penalty, like a civil penalty. So maybe something like a fine. Usually when we're talking about decriminalisation in the form of drug policy, it might be that you're referred to an education programme or a treatment programme instead. And so long as you sort of positively comply with that programme, you get to avoid getting a criminal record or anything like that. So this is an approach that Portugal is well known for doing in 2001. It's an approach that's widely referred to as decriminalisation, but I like to refer to it as a public health approach to low-level drug offences. So in Portugal, the way this works is that if you're found in possession of a small amount of drugs in Portugal, you actually have to meet a commission of the dissuasion of drug addiction, and that comprises of a lawyer, psychiatrist and a social worker to discuss treatment options. So they invested heavily in those services beforehand, and for it to be effective, it is something that requires that investment. Now, some countries have just decriminalised cannabis. Some states have decriminalised cannabis and then some psychedelics as well. But in Portugal, they decided that, you know, it's not the individual drug that matters, it's the person's relationship with it. So on that basis, they decriminalised all drugs. And what that also sort of alludes to is that models of decriminalisation vary considerably depending on where they're placed, you know, in which country. The UK has trialled decriminalisation to a small extent through diversion schemes, which are excellent. And I do suggest, if you don't know what those are, go and explore them a bit more. But it's kind of similar to the Portuguese model, where you're sent for to either into treatment or into education if you're caught in possession of drugs, rather than a criminal penalty. Generally, kind of the pros of that is that we do see less drug-related harm instead of more. And that's largely because, like I said, the approach has shifted from one that has more public health goals in mind and education and harm reduction rather than focused on criminalisation. what's also quite good is that it, you know, protects the prospects of youthful users and youthful workers, because, you know, by giving someone a criminal record, you're effectively barring people from contributing to society through certain forms of education, certain forms of employment, travel, if we're looking at the US, even though it's ridiculous because half the states have legalized it. But they have these really long-term and very serious impacts for people, which is ridiculous when most drug use is, you know, very transient. People tend to do it for a bit, mostly in their 20s, and then kind of stop as they go into their 30s, and only a minority become problematic users. So Release have done a great report looking at decriminalisation, the scale of it across the globe. So I would recommend that if you're interested more in decriminalisation. But it does have its limitations in that because it only decriminalises the possession of small amounts of drugs, i.e. cannabis, it means that the market itself is still unlawful. So it's not taking away the inherent risk of taking a controlled, unregulated drug. You know, you've still probably acquired it from a drug dealer in most circumstances. You're not sure what it is, you're maybe not sure of the content, or you might have been told the content, but whether it's that, who knows? It's never been tested, there's no sort of safety factors, there's no labeling. And also buyers can be exposed through other drugs through that route, which takes us on to legal regulation and what that is. And when a drug is legally regulated, like we see with alcohol and tobacco, it means that the user would face no action for being in possession of the drug at all, so long as no other, you know, criminal activities are being committed. And whatever that legalization model extends to, some extend to, you know, small scale self-cultivation of cannabis plants in the home, some don't. And I'll go more into the, you know, different types of legal regulation on the next slide, but just as a sort of summary note, you know, neither decriminalisation or legal regulation propose to be a silver bullet to solve either the harmful outcomes of prohibition or completely prevent all risk of harms associated with drug use. You know, reform is a means, not an end. They're a different approach. They've still got to be invested in, they've got to be evaluated, and they've got to evolve as new evidence comes to light. So the scale of cannabis legal regulation, it has in recent years gone from something that was just a theory, being on the very sort of fringes of drug policy debate, and you looked quite crazy if you mentioned it, to a real working example across the globe, internationally speaking. So it is quite an exciting time. Washington and Colorado were the first US states to legalize all the way back in 2012, and now other states seem to be falling like dominoes. So we've got 16 in total have now decided to legally regulate. I think 4 states legalized all in one go at the end of last year, and New York just legalized a couple of weeks ago. So it's moving, things are moving incredibly quickly in the US. However, this also means that because a number of states have only recently passed legislation, it means that it's not actually being implemented yet. It does take a bit of time to set up a completely regulated market. You know, some countries can take up to 2 years to kind of properly get it in place as it would like to look. And also because some of these legislation proposals passed through bill initiatives in the state, some of them weren't really sure what that legalization model was going to look like, and they're still in the process of working it out. But it's estimated that around 1 in 3 Americans now live in a state where recreational cannabis is legal. Despite the fact that federally it's technically still prohibited, but we expect that to change in the sort of hopefully coming months, but we'll see.
The organization part of the educational program is not very keen on letting us do something different because of the current situation, like the pandemic and stuff like that.
Anyone else is speaking, or is it just me? Okay, it's gone. Yeah, so the devil is really in the details when it comes to how cannabis is legalized and therefore what it hopes to achieve. So a really good example is the most recent New York bill, which seemed to have taken stock of some of the shortcomings of those very early states that legalized. So they've done things like ensure that the cannabis law there and how it's going to be, implemented includes social equity licensing and small business incubator programs and community reinvestment and tax revenue which will invest in communities that were harmed by the war of drugs in the first place. And that's to name just a few aspects. So it's really great to see that there's developments happening there, because some of the initial states that legalized, they didn't really have a strong approach, and it was very, very commercialized, and there were some sort of issues surrounding that. Uruguay was the first country, so countrywide, to legalize and regulate every level of the cannabis market, which it did in 2013. Uruguay has always, adopted relatively liberal policies and has, strangely been quite ahead of the game. So in some ways, it wasn't surprising. Although what was surprising about Uruguay is that most of the population didn't really support cannabis legalization. It actually came from their politician or their president saying, I think this would be good for the country. And then as they've legalized, the public have got on board with it and kind of are starting to see the merits of it. It's got a much more state-centered approach. So cannabis can only be bought from pharmacies, even if you just want it for recreational use. And initially, they only had two or three types of herbal cannabis, which were relatively low potency in terms of THC. And you have to register with the government to be able to get hold of cannabis through the pharmacies, or if you want to grow it yourself. So compared to the USA, it's very strict in terms of how it's decided to regulate cannabis. And then you've got Canada, which was the second country to legalize, as distinct from sort of individual states in the US, which it did so in 2018. However, more are on the way. Switzerland is actually launching a fully legalized adult use cannabis market trial in part of the country this May. So that'll understand the impact of cannabis legalization from that part of the country to the other. So that should hopefully provide some really interesting data so that to sort of move things ahead. Other countries are also in the process of either seriously debating what model of cannabis legalization they want, or what they think would work best. There are countries like Mexico and Luxembourg as well. Luxembourg, it's great that that's happening in Europe. And what this kind of shows is that, particularly if we take an international perspective, for a number of countries, it's not just, well, should we legalize? It's, okay, we're probably going to have to legalize cannabis. This makes a lot of sense. How do we do it? What model works best? And how does that take into account, the values of our country, and how does it respond to the goals and outcomes that we want to have? A quick special mention would be Spain, which has a quasi-legal model. So it hasn't legalized cannabis, but it has a decriminalization policy, which kind of allows cannabis social clubs over there. So it's decriminalized to grow a small number of plants, so long as it's in your home and out of view of the public. And that's basically been extended to create this social club model. And again, Spain's always had a kind of relatively liberal approach to drug use. I was very fortunate to grow up there, and found it very bizarre coming back to England and things being so strict, particularly around cannabis, because in Spain it's no one really cares. But it's not legally regulated. People who run these cannabis social clubs still get in trouble. We've had someone go into jail recently. And also to note that the Netherlands also hasn't legalized. It has these cafes where you can go and buy cannabis, but the entire illicit market behind it is still unlawful. So I think there was a study done testing the cannabis products you could get in these cafes based on what you're told it is and what's actually in it. And it varies wildly. And that's because, in all fairness to those cafes, it's they can't be certain what's in it because they don't know where it's being sourced from. So in summary, the impact of cannabis law reform depends on the specific regulations and how these are implemented and enforced in each jurisdiction. So as I said, Uruguay has, a very strict sort of government controlled supply of cannabis approach compared to, the very liberal commercialized markets of the US, particularly those early ones that went first. And then Canada has a system of legal supply that's a bit of a hybrid in the middle of these two systems. So it has got a commercial aspect, but then it's very sort of limited sort of retail and use providers. But then, things are changing all the time as well, as more countries are getting involved in this debate, and as more states keep legally regulating as well. Just to note for further reading, if you're interested in more of the kind of nuances between the different models, this paper by Transform is brilliant, and I'm pretty sure they're bringing out a new edition soon, so it'll be up to date. So in the UK, so my message to you is to not get complacent, just because we've seen all of these exciting things happen internationally, because it's not being seriously considered here in perhaps the way we might hope. Earlier this month, you might have seen that the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, wanted to set up an independent London Drugs Commission to examine the potential health, economic and criminal justice benefits of decriminalising cannabis. And he was doing this citing fresh polling data, which, literally from this month, which finds that 52% of Britons support the legalisation of cannabis and only 32% oppose it. Sadly, and a bit dishearteningly, this was very quickly rebutted by Number 10 and those very close to the Prime Minister, stating that he has no plans to legalise this harmful substance, and citing the age-old line that suppressing demand is the key to success. And frustratingly, both of these articles mentioned decriminalisation and legalisation interchangeably as if they're synonymous. So it still shows the challenges that we have, the level of ignorance that we have, and what we're trying to change. And just a quick note from a political viewpoint as well, in terms of this polling data, we collected our own polling data in 2019. We had a similar result. I think it was 49% supported. So it is good that we're seeing it incrementally go up. That's kind of what we would expect. But what we also found was that, particularly conservative voters were much more resistant to cannabis legalization. And what was interesting is across the political spectrum, people from all different parties, sort of everyone agreed our approach to drug policy doesn't work, criminalisation doesn't work, it doesn't stop people trying drugs, doesn't stop people use them, it doesn't prevent the harms of drugs. But then when you present people with, alternatives such as decriminalisation and such as cannabis legalisation, people are a little bit resistant to those. The way I interpret that is that, these alternative approaches to criminalisation have to be better justified and better explained. So how do we do that? How do we go about modernising drug policy? Well, the first thing is we need to recognise that our current approach of prohibition and criminalisation isn't working. You'd think that we maybe had figured that out, but certainly from those two articles, you can see that government still thinks that this is the best approach. So what I like to do is usually kind of cite their own research, which is that, in 2006, a Science and Technology Select Committee's report, which was commissioned by the government, found no convincing evidence of a deterrent effect, which is widely seen as underpinning the whole government's classification policy, where government's Class B. So that was in 2006. Then again, in 2010, the Home Office's own evaluation of the 2010 drug strategy says we spend 1.6 billion on law enforcement every year, and it has little impact on the availability of drugs. And it also goes on to describe the drugs market as resilient, and then it outlines a whole list of unintended consequences of prohibition, one of those being increased violence of drug markets. Then again, in 2014, another Home Office report looking at different legal frameworks concluded that there was no obvious relationship between the toughness of a country's law enforcement against drug possession and levels of drug use in that country. And this is been supported yet again by the most recent support in 2020, the Carol Black report, commissioned by the government, part 1, which concluded that, you know, the government interventions to restrict supply have had limited success. And very interestingly, what it said was, even if these organisations like the police were sufficiently resourced and, you know, had the capital and time needed, it still probably wouldn't bring about a sustained reduction in drug supply. I mean, no one's done it successfully. And that's because of the resilience and the flexibility of the illicit drugs market. So when party leaders, like we saw in those articles before, try to suggest that our drug strategy is to disrupt the supply of drugs and the way is to suppress demand and that's the key to success, this is not actually what the government's own evaluations of its own drug strategy says, probably begrudgingly, to be fair. So that's usually a good starting point to cite their own reports at them. But we can't just replace this failing system with nothing. You know, that would be a disaster. We've got to provide something better. We've got to recommend something better. And if we're going to recommend legalizing cannabis as part of that approach, we've got to convince policymakers and ministers that this approach can provide better outcomes. And we need to outline what the goals of legal regulation are. And how we impact those. Secondly is, you know, we've got to change the goalpost to something more attainable. If we're trying to convince policymakers that cannabis legalization is going to create this, you know, drug-free utopia, which, you know, their current method is trying to do and has failed. We need to be very transparent and honest in what we think the legalization of cannabis is going to achieve. And we need to, you know, put forward things like there being greater emphasis on things like public health. So I'll move on to the next slide, which, you know, covers a number of different goals and aims that we should be aiming for. And the point of this is that, you know, also when we're having conversations with other people from different political ideologies, you know, different groups, we need to present a number of different goals that cannabis legalization does hope to achieve and how it's going to go about achieving them. So, you know, a big thing is that, you know, there should be less harms from cannabis through legalization, not more. How do we go about achieving that? How do we protect young people from the dangerous effects of cannabis? You know, we could argue that because there's an age restriction in some countries that have legalized it's 18, others in 21, you know, in the US, the drinking age is 21. Is that going to successfully and better restrict access from young people to cannabis, which, you know, cannabis is currently easier to access than alcohol. And there is some early data from countries that have legalized to show that cannabis use among young people certainly hasn't gone up, and in some places it's decreased. But it can be quite difficult to concretely sort of prove that one way or the other, although the evidence is generally on the whole quite positive. And like I said, other countries and states are kind of learning from what other states and countries have done. You know, will it reduce the size of the illegal market? I think initially there were, you know, we were suggesting that cannabis legalization would, you know, abolish the illegal market for cannabis, and that's an unrealistic goal to have. What we want is to, you know, reduce the size of it, which, you know, Canada to an extent has demonstrated, but it certainly hasn't got rid of it. You know, the black market is very resilient, and we need to be prepared for that. It also needs to demonstrate value for money. If we're going to legalize cannabis, in the same way that Portugal, you know, heavily invested in, you know, a public health response to drugs when it decriminalized, as we're seeing New York put special sort of social equity measures in, we need to demonstrate that the money that we spend on legalizing cannabis is going to give us more value for money than the, you know, 1.4 billion that we spend on enforcement already. So we need to talk about, you know, how is it going to free up police time? There was a great study done by UCL in 2014 that decriminalised cannabis somewhere in London, and what they found was that actually other crimes were dealt with. So things like burglary and even cases of sexual assault and rape. Those things were being dealt with because the police weren't looking or dealing with people smoking cannabis. So these are the kind of things that we need to be talking about. How can it promote business models that advance sustainable development? There has been concerns that if we legally regulate, will it be problematic for the environment? There are other issues of, will it block people from entering the market, the same marginalized groups that were so affected by the kind of our prohibition and war on drugs in the first place. So these are all the types of conversations that we need to be having, and we also need to address the evidence gaps. Evidence-based policy making isn't like evidence-based medicines or evidence-based science. That's a bit more straightforward. You have clinical trials, you're testing something in a very controlled setting that accounts, so there's no other outliers that might be involved, and you progress to a randomized controlled trial and you can test one thing against the placebo. I guess Switzerland is trying to do that in its own way by having a trial in one part of the country there. But we're never going to produce this kind of golden egg of evidence that says to a minister or policy maker, or even just someone who isn't convinced by by cannabis legalization, that if we do this, this is a surefire way of reducing all of these problems. It's not a silver bullet. But what we need is to shift the goalposts and have a different mindset and say we're going to take a different approach, because we believe it's a better approach. We believe that it should be focused on public health and human rights and those sort of things, and we believe that that can result in better outcomes. And in order to ensure that, something that we've not done much with our existing sort of drug policy is we need to set up methods of evaluation and monitoring strategies. So how do we create measurable outcomes? An issue that we've seen with some of the early places that legalized cannabis is they didn't have the proper monitoring in place. So there might be all this kind of brilliant data, but it's not being collected in the way that you might hope it would be, and in sort of the most credible way. So it still creates these questions and these concerns around it. So what can we do? So first off would be support and engage with organizations like the CDPRG, but others that I've mentioned as well. I would actually recommend you follow a diverse group of different organizations, and align yourself with the depth of the discussion. And then the best thing you can do is speak to people who are not already convinced, particularly those who come from different ideological backgrounds, different political backgrounds. I was talking about polling data earlier, and 52% back cannabis legalization. That's heavily based or influenced by demographics. So as soon as you get to kind of people in their 50s, 60s, they're all opposed to it. And you have to remember that, in the Conservative Party, the average voter, I think, is 55. The average Conservative voter is 60 or 65. So, if you think of yourself as a MP or a politician, you might see that 52% and say, oh, but people in my constituency, people outside of London don't really want this, and my voting demographic don't really want this. So, there needs to be a good reason for them to start having a serious conversation about it. So talk to people that don't potentially already think that we should legalize. That's really useful. And then finally, write to your MP. I think they say if an MP receives 8 letters, he'll actually, or she will actually address it. It is actually really useful. It always makes me really happy to know that someone's written to their MP, because if you're saying, the more personal, the better. But if you're saying, I've read this report, what have you done to actively engage with this report? What is your position on this? They may just come back to you and state sort of the same line. I don't want to sort of be too optimistic, but if people keep writing in, after a while, they do say, okay, I need to reach out to one of these groups and I need to get my position right on this. So, the PM's recent comments or people's close to him you know, that really betrays, you know, his misunderstanding of his own evidence coming out from his own government. So that's the kind of switch that makes him go, oh, okay, I kind of need to inform myself on this now because I don't want to appear ill-informed on this topic. And then finally, as this year is the 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act. So Transform is actually spearheading this, but there's a number of different drug policy organisations. We're all supporting this. And we're basically asking for a review of the Misuse of Drugs Act. And like I said earlier, the foundational evidence for cannabis is missing, archived, who knows what. So it's going to be a really interesting campaign, and it's really going to support the idea that ministers can't just continue to ignore this. So that would be the final thing, that if you're interested in this topic and in this area, please do support us, please do educate yourself further, and please do have informed conversations, particularly with those who don't necessarily disagree. So yeah, that I'll say thank you. And we have got a number of other reports on our webpage. You can follow us on Twitter, and open to questions.
Amazing, thank you so much. If you want to unmute and give a round of applause, it was a great talk. Wonderful. Yeah, I personally have so many questions, but maybe we won't get to them all. But you know, I'll go with the ones that are in the chat first.
A huge topic.
Yeah, and it's definitely one that I'm deeply interested in. So first question is from Guy. Isn't it from a H.P. Lovecraft story originally? I think he was talking about the beginning of your
420.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
Open to explore the roots of 420. It seems that we're not quite sure, but
second question was, why was cannabis made unlawful originally? That was back in the 70s, right?
Yeah. Again, there are entire books on this subject. You know, one thing that I will say again, because it is incredibly interesting, is the foundational evidence of why it was put in the Misuse of Drugs Act is missing, has been archived. So we can't even challenge it. And that's a real problem. You know, if we're trying to promote evidence-based drug policy, you need the evidence to demonstrate why it's controlled in the first place. And another thing that's quite interesting is, you know, the drugs are only supposed to be controlled if they pose a serious social harm and social threat to society. So one thing we're trying to understand from government, okay, so how do you determine that a drug constitutes a social threat and a social harm? And, you know, they haven't got back to us on that yet. But largely, I do think the reason why cannabis was prohibited, and the reason why most drugs are prohibited, is that, you know, it usually does have roots in marginalized groups, racism. This was largely driven by the US, ironically, and the UN Convention, which kind of, I mean, really did force a lot of countries to follow suit. I think actually the UK was quite resistant, but countries that weren't getting on board, you know, they were being threatened with all sorts of things, you know, they can't trade and whatnot. So we're in such a weird position because, you know, the country that kind of forced this trend now has, like I said, you know, 1 in 3 of its own citizens in a state where they could legally access cannabis. Yet, you know, we're still told, you know, we need to follow the UN conventions, and it's like, well, you know, we don't. We can, you know, we can do what we like. So yeah, Neil Woods has spoken extensively on this, and it is very complicated, but certainly I would say the reasons that it's controlled don't really quite stand up now. So that, you know, the bare minimum that we're asking for from, you know, this campaign about the review of the Misuse of Drugs Act is, let's review what drugs are in there and why, and let's have proper foundational evidence that's kept up to date to at least justify why they're in there, surely, as a bare minimum.
Yeah, definitely. So do you want to expand on what you sent me? No.
Sorry?
Did you want to expand on, I think you said like the Freedom of Information Act, or was that only in the US?
Yeah. I guess I had no idea that this evidence went missing. That sounds like a kind of absurd thing to be a fact. And isn't there any like, in the United States, there's like a Freedom of Information Act or something like that, where you should be.
So that's the next step, is a Freedom of Information request to the National Archives government department. So we're on to stage 2. But I mean, this is very common in, and sort of unfortunately in drug policy reform, this kind of getting passed from pillar to post, and oh no, it's that person's problem, they've got it over there, and it also, you know, it's what adds so much length onto it as well. But yeah, it's hilarious.
I was, if I may, Annie, I was wondering, what do you think this mood is behind like this general understanding of like drugs are not going to happen for us? Like Boris Johnson just being like, Boris Johnson is naturally liberal, but he's still not going to kind of change drug policies. Do you think it has to be like a structural change in the government's like just this government?
Yeah, it's going to have to be. I feel that it is getting increasingly difficult. You know, and this is on the basis that you know, we're now understanding the medicinal purposes of cannabis and other drugs as well. So it is getting increasingly difficult for the government to defend its position, yet they still do. The Home Office have backed itself into a very difficult corner, because their response is always the same line, is that drugs are unlawful, drugs are bad, and we're not going to engage with the nuances, because it will have to come from a ministerial directive to do so, but no one wants to put their neck on the line. And that's largely because, and this is why I also said, you know, the importance of having conversations with people that are not already convinced, is that, you know, there's a genuine fear that if they support cannabis legalization, that you know, their constituents won't actually support that. You know, support of cannabis legalization is like over 60% in London. So it's London that's really driving up that figure, and then as you go sort of further out, it becomes less and less. And like I also said, you know, age was a very strong determinant. So as soon the public is ahead, but unfortunately 52% of the public supporting it, as we've seen, isn't quite the kind of, you know, convincing thing that we want it to be. Because like I said, you know, MPs and ministers will be thinking, well, you know, there's going to be all of these other factors, these different demographics, and we're not in London, etc., etc. So, but as soon as the public view does change, the ministers will fall. And I feel like it's one of those things that could happen quite quickly when it's done. But, you know, what we don't want, and which is why, you know, we support, you know, Sadiq Khan, at least sort of in the sense that, yes, we should be looking at this. I would argue that we should be looking at decriminalisation and legalisation. You know, you can't really legalise without having a period of decriminalisation. I don't really fully support the decriminalisation of just cannabis. I think, why create this exceptionalism? I can understand the merits of legalising cannabis and other drugs. We sort of need to know a bit more about how that would look. I think Colombia is seriously debating legalising cocaine, for example, but it, you know, that would be completely unprecedented and very new. So yeah, we need to keep having those conversations, and we need to keep writing to, you know, MPs and being actively involved in it. And like I say, honestly, I think the best thing you can do is just talk to people that you know, are not convinced, and then try and, because what I've seen happen with cannabis legalization is as I was talking about goals earlier, the goals have really kind of transformed, where we've kind of learned of, oh, actually, you know, cannabis legalization isn't this silver bullet. There are problems to it. And I think that's because proponents of drug policy reform and cannabis legalization have felt pressured to sell it as this kind of beautiful thing that can solve all problems. And that's why we kind of need to be a bit more realistic in what it can achieve, and also change the mindset as well. And like I say, it's getting there, but that's why I think one of my main messages is like, do not get complacent, because, you know, we have concerningly the Prime Minister citing a very usual outdated line, which is, you know, concerning, as like you say, you know, he is a Liberal politician, so you're kind of a bit like, if Boris isn't on board, how, you know, how do we do it? Not to say that it can't, but and also the government are very fearful of looking like they are looking at it, because then they're worried that, you know, that'll be the domino effect and all the cards will fall. So, you know, if you've maintained such a strong position for so long, you have to be very careful about the first thing that you say that is different. So that would be my final thought to add to that.
Yeah, I wonder, when we're talking to people about decriminalization, whether we might use an analogy. I don't know what you think about this, but I always thought about decriminalization of cannabis specifically as kind of treating it like a speeding ticket or some other kind of fine that you might get from like a parking violation or something like that. You know, it's still a crime, but it's not punished as severely. And I think perhaps using that kind of analogy would perhaps help people kind of think differently about decriminalization.
Yeah, certainly, because that's where the confusion lies. People think decriminalization means that there is no criminal offence, and
yeah, like some kind of free-for-all. But
it's complicated by the fact that lots of countries do it differently. But generally, yeah, if you're not complying with whatever the lower penalty is, i.e., if you don't pay your fine for a speeding ticket, you know, something worse happens or it incrementally gets higher. So yeah, totally agree with you. And it's frustrating that media and ministers can't seem to get a grip of the differences between the two.
And I think it's confusing as well, because the stories that we get from friends and from people in our communities when they're interacting with police in the context of like cannabis use is people get let off with a warning, or they don't do anything about it because it's too much paperwork, or, you know, I think we get all of these kind of anecdotal stories, and what we really need is, like you said, evidence-based policy changes, which is even more difficult, like you explained.
I would add to that, actually, a first step that we could take, which I very much support, is I mentioned diversion schemes briefly.
Yeah, what can you expand on that?
Yeah, so it's basically a form of decriminalisation. So yeah, a police officer would determine, okay, I've caught you you're in possession of a small amount of drugs. Evaluate the situation. Is this someone that's got a drug dependency issue? Should they be referred to something else, or should we just send them on a kind of drugs awareness type course? They vary. Some people give you one chance, and then if you get caught again, then you're sort of dealt with the usual way. Some give you multiple chances. You know, but this has to be a national scheme now. We've trialed it. We know it works well. Not only does it work well, police prefer it. Like the amount of admin and cost that goes into, you know, if you find drugs on somebody, it's got to be stored in the right way. It creates all of this paperwork, which is why we've got, you know, such this sort of divergent response. You know, I speak to a lot of patients who are self-medicating with cannabis, and even them, it's completely 50-50. Sometimes, you know, they feel the full force of the law. Other times there's someone who's not a patient and has been growing 20 plants and nothing really happens. They just sort of, you know, end up ignoring, or they just take the plants away and that's it. So we've got this real issue where we've got some parts of the, I mean, I remember you know, when I lived in Brixton, I kind of just assumed that in the UK, I was like, cannabis is kind of like de facto decriminalised, nobody cares. Because, you know, in Brixton it's kind of more tolerated there, and then you go to Camden and the police are kind of all over it. So it creates, again, this very unfair system where, you know, some people who are receiving criminal records are just because they were kind of unlucky. And you know, it's really unfortunate. So I strongly support diversion schemes being rolled out across the country, because you know, no, it's not cannabis legalization, but it's an important first step in changing that mindset of we don't need to respond with criminalization first and foremost, that actually we can have better outcomes from this approach. And that might be the effect that kind of makes us realize that a different approach is going to be better. The Sewell report recently, you know, which was trying to say that racism didn't exist in the UK, the one good thing that came out of that was its recommendation of diversion schemes. So now it's kind of like, okay, well, we've already tested them. Please, can we just, you know, nationally roll those out now? And there are a lot of police officers that strongly support those. Yeah, so I would recommend looking into that topic and supporting it if you can.
Yeah, definitely. But on that kind of topic of the government's policy towards drugs, can you clarify what they kind of mean by suppressed demand? Because I find this to be a political statement that is just a bit of jargon that I think has like a bit of a sinister undertone. Do they just mean they want to stop people wanting to take drugs? Because I don't really think that's realistic.
Well, I mean, we're also in a time when the Prime Minister is talking about a campaign to, you know, discourage middle class people from using cocaine. We're in very weird times. Didn't really see that coming. I thought this kind of approach was, you know, clearly seen as ridiculous, but unfortunately that's what we're still dealing with. But yeah, I mean, you'll often see, you know, police being like, oh, we've arrested this person and we caught this many plants. But you know, Neil Woods, who was an undercover police officer for many years, you know, his kind of wake up point when he realized, you know, this approach isn't working was when, you know, they shut down this huge, you know, drugs gang and they stopped the supply of drugs for like a few minutes. So, and as I said, I just cited 4 of their own reports. There are probably more that shows that this kind of stop supply approach, not only is it not working, I mean, cannabis is probably the easiest controlled drug to get hold of. Not only is it not working, but it has all of these negative and problematic, you know, side effects. So we're still at the point, unfortunately, at some situations where we're still having to remind ministers, but your own report said this. And an interesting thing as well is that one of those reports, I think it was the 2014 one, it was supposed to go a step further and actually recommend decriminalisation. And then I've forgotten who it was a Lib Dem MP at the time, accused the government of basically getting hold of it and saying we can't recommend decriminalisation, it's a government report, and taking that bit out. So it still said, okay, our approach doesn't work, but it wouldn't go the step further and actually recommend decriminalisation. That's the level of kind of fear that we're talking about in terms of reform.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Great. In the spirit of, you know, utopian dreams of a world of, you know, a country or a state that legalizes cannabis, I wonder what the kind of implications are in terms of suffering and harm reduction in a situation when a state or country legalizes cannabis. Are they also responsible, or would they take responsibility for regulating ethical farming and ethical production and distribution?
Yeah, that's what I think some countries and states are starting to realise. Having said that, you know, that's been off the back of there's some great drug policy organisations in the States that you know, as our knowledge has improved, you know, we've recognised some of these issues and ways to make it better. And that's why I say, you know, really the debate shouldn't be about, you know, do we or don't we legalise cannabis. We should be, and the government should be, looking very seriously at all of the different models and saying, okay, what are the best bits and what are the things that we need to implement, and how can we, you know, undo some of the harms that our current approach implemented, and how can we actually have, you know, especially, you know, we're in a post-Brexit world, you know, how can we create good business of this that's, you know, good for everyone, you know, isn't just a few monopolies getting involved, you know, isn't this kind of issue of corporate capture and all of that. And that's another way of just saying, you know, I think in the early days, you know, legalizing cannabis was a little bit seen as this utopia that would just be great and fix everything. And it's definitely better than prohibition, but it wasn't perfect. And we are learning from that. And you know, one of the things I would say in terms of, you know, speaking to ministers and government is, you know, let's not do what we did with medical cannabis, which is wait 20 years after the government first recommended to reschedule it, to do it as a knee-jerk reaction to a kid, you know, having epileptic seizures in hospital. That's the only reason, you know, we knew, we had the evidence that it made sense to reschedule it 20 years before. So now we have, you know, when we, you know, sort of rescheduled cannabis so it could be prescribed medicinally, or more extensively medicinally, I should say, you know, that really sort of built up everyone's expectations. But the government knew that access was going to be extremely limited because, you know, we unfortunately don't have the scientific evidence to warrant mass prescribing of untested cannabis products for medicinal use via the NHS. You know, the NHS have to be cost effective. You know, and if they're, you know, if they're choosing between, you know, they've got one patient who's got terminal lung cancer and there's this new drug and it's really expensive, or there's a cannabis drug which, you know, isn't, you know, is separate in the case of epilepsy, but in other cases is, you know, not solving someone's health condition but helping manage it, you know, they're probably going to go for the new cancer drug. You know, the NHS is already massively, you know, underfunded. They have to work along the lines. So you know, the reason why as a group, you know, we haven't got a particular policy position on whether we should legalize or not, but what we want is to see a government department that is actually capable of using the evidence that we do have and being reactive and flexible to that, rather than a government that hasn't budged for 50 years. It's got to budge at some point, right?
Yeah, I just find it so kind of interesting because, you know, none of that conversation is happening around tobacco production, and none of that conversation is happening around alcohol production and the ethical, you know, consequences of those. So yeah. Well,
alcohol and tobacco have, yeah, unfortunately given regulation a bit of a bad name in the first place, which is the issue. So obviously, I mean, I always say we've learned so many great things from alcohol and tobacco of how not to do it. But it doesn't set, you know, the greatest example, because again, you know, the older demographics will remember the time when cigarettes were reported as healthy and good for you and didn't have any nasty side effects. You know, and particularly, you know, when some US states first legalized, there were aspects of it that, you know, personally, I think were a little bit problematic. You know, you can get chocolate bars of like really crazy high strength and all of these things. And, you know, products that you would have no idea have cannabis in them because they're not properly labeled and that kind of thing. So, you know, there is this concern of, you know, if you don't strictly regulate it, are you just going to create more problems and more issues? And actually another thing to add is the UK is much more concerned about, you know, issues of psychosis and things like that. You know, people in the US are sometimes like, what are you talking about? But part of that is because a lot of the psychosis studies and data do come from the UK. So we're more familiar with that research. So there's kind of more pressure on us to address that research and make sure, you know, that we understand that as best as possible and build that in to our regulation. So understanding the you know, the negative impacts that it can have, and why is that? Is it because people are using, you know, a high THC strain and very little CBD? How can we mitigate against those issues? You know, we're always going to have, you know, like I said, legal regulation is never going to prevent any harms from happening from drugs. I mean, all drugs, all substances are dangerous. You know, depends on the dose. If we drink too much water, that's going to be a problem, right? So we need to understand as much as we can so that we can mitigate against those issues. And in some ways, there was a report that only came out today that showed that people in US states that have legalized, you've got more new users of cannabis. Now, some people will see that as a negative thing because the goal that they think they should have is, well, we're not going to have any more users. It's just going to allow the people that are using it to do so a little bit more safely. Whereas actually, is it a bad thing if we've got an older generation, which is what the data has showed, trying more cannabis because they're trying a product that helps their arthritis or something like that? It's we've got to sort of familiarize ourselves with these and like I say, be prepared to move the goalposts, but being directed with what the latest evidence says. And the evidence is never going to say you should do exactly this, but this is why we need to kind of have a body that can, have all the relevant disciplines involved to be able to respond appropriately when it comes out.
Great, thank
Cannabis
you.
is a very complex drug. It's very frustrating to research. Much to the frustration of governments as well, who can't even get their heads around CBD at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Dexter, do you want to ask your question?
Which one was this? Was this the London decriminalized one? Oh yeah, I was wondering. You mentioned a study that UCL did in a part of London where cannabis was decriminalized. I was wondering if you knew where that was, and if there are other like kind of unspoken, implicit assumptions in certain places in the UK that cannabis is decriminalized. Like you mentioned, kind of I think Brixton, and yeah, is there some way of knowing that in a useful sense?
No, I mean, you can infer certain things from data. Like there's some parts of the country where we have, for example, like known to police cannabis cafes, and the police just think, I'd rather allow it, let it happen over there. If I disrupt it, I'm just going to have more issues. I'm just going to drive people to the black market. Loads of ill people actually go there and use cannabis as, self-treat. So no is the short answer. But the UCL study, I know it was in 2014, and I asked this exact same question a few years ago because I was like, that sounds like a great study. But I think it was in Lambeth. So if you Google Lambeth UCL decriminalised cannabis, it will probably come up. But yeah, those outcomes are, that's the kind of really interesting data to be discussing with people and say, because I think if you have a person in front of you and you say, or do you support the legalization of cannabis, that might have all kinds of scary connotations with it. Most of voters are conservatives and they're social conservatives. So that's very all scary. I don't want things to change. I think we need to stick with the institutions and the way that we've got things. When you say, would you rather the police spend time approaching a young person because they smell of cannabis, or actually dealing with your burglary, or actually dealing with that sexual assault, because dealing with those crimes go up when you're not dealing with cannabis? That's when people's minds start to change. When it's presented in that way, what would you prefer? You're probably going to get a more favorable answer.
Cool, thank you.
Before I go to my question, I'll ask Linus this question, unless Linus, you want to ask it.
No, it's lovely to hear your voice, Annie.
Okay. Was the fact that a lot of cabinet ministers took drugs in their youth very delegitimizing for anti-drug policy?
Yes, I would say that it is. I think
I would agree.
Yeah. No, but it is.
Michael Gove and cocaine is yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more. I mean, I think Boris Johnson's. Well, the problem is that everyone admits to using cannabis or something else, and then they say, "Oh, but I didn't like it. It was a horrible experience. I'd never use it again." Although I think Gove has admitted to using cocaine repeatedly. But yeah, sorry, what was that?
Repeatedly, just once saying that he's done it once was not enough. It
was on several occasions. So I don't know. But yeah, I think that's a real issue, and because what we're saying is that, you know, we'll prevent, we already know that approach doesn't prevent people from trying drugs, because, you know, a great proportion of people try drugs, but like I said, it tends to be this kind of transient thing. So why are we just punishing the unfortunate people that get caught in it? And I think what was, you know, pretty disheartening about Gove, you know, not supporting drug policy reform, is I think he was also, you know, Minister for Education at some point. And we know that if you're a teacher and you get caught, you know, if you have a criminal record or you get caught in possession of drugs, you have to tell the school that you're working for. So you may lose your job. You might be a perfectly, you know, great teacher. Who knows, you know, why you had drugs on you, or what was happening. But, you know, I remember getting into a bit of a Twitter argument with somebody because, you know, they said, oh, well, it's not a problem if people have a criminal record, because, you know, employers can still employ you. It's just that, you know, it's good that employers know that, you know, they can see that if you've got in trouble for drugs. I was like, well, it's only if they're unlucky enough to have got caught in the first place. You know, I've known people tell me that they picked up drugs from outside the Home Office. Like, it's in and obviously didn't get caught. Although I do know of another story where someone a police officer did catch a guy, and he worked for the Home Office, and he said he felt awful because the guy was like sobbing because he was so upset because he was probably going to lose his job. Because I don't know, maybe you can work for the Home Office and have a criminal record, but, you know, it's just it's just ridiculous, and it is very unfair. So we have to sort of remind those particular MPs and ministers that they too did that, and they were just lucky enough to not get caught. So yeah, it's something that we do have to keep reminding them of their own sort of hypocrisy. Well, and the fact that some ministers have, you know, the Home Office minister, previous one, had to stand down because they had shares in medical cannabis. So there's a lot of things that don't, you know, quite
add up,
and we need to keep pressing people on that.
Yeah, in light of pressing people on that, do you have any kind of advice? Or I know people at my uni love a good template letter to fill out, to send to their MP or to their head of department. Do you have anything like that? Does Conservative Drug Policy Reform Group offer any support like that?
Not yet specifically for cannabis. So we have one in the mix for rescheduling psilocybin. We want that to be rescheduled to Schedule 2, so it can bring, so it can allow the clinical trials to continue, you know, at a much lower cost, which will get medicines derived from psilocybin to patients sooner, so long as there's sort of positive results, and at a lower price, because, you know, doing a clinical study phase 3 with a Schedule 1 drug is going to be much more expensive than if it's in Schedule 2. So we haven't got anything specifically on cannabis yet. And I'm not sure if we will. We may have one on a separate topic, but that is because I do think templates can be great, but I also think the more personal, the better, particularly on drug policy, particularly if you're writing to your own MP and saying, this is my experience, I've read this report. Have you looked at it? What do you think? I mean, even writing to your MP and say, you know, I have been a victim of being arrested, or my friend has, or, you know, writing these situations, they might not always seem it, but they are human. And when they read these personal stories, and that is a member of their constituent, you know, I can't promise that they'll always hear that, but, you know, more often than not they do, and especially if it's coming from multiple times. So we may have a letter in the future. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if it was specifically cannabis, but the more personal, the better. And it doesn't need to be too long. But I would just recommend, you know, reading a report that resonates with you, and then sharing your story and asking them, what are they doing? You know, sometimes it's better to not sort of go for the straight, you know, why won't you legalize cannabis or whatever the initiative is, to say, what are you doing to actively be a part of this conversation? And that's when MPs kind of go, oh, okay, maybe I will have to, you know, speak to my colleagues about this actually, or attend an event that's going on within Parliament about this topic, because I need to be informed because people are asking me about this. If they see that it's something that is an issue for their constituents, it is their duty to respond and at the very least be informed on it.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have time, but we've just had another question from Lee Cohen, who says, hello, I just zoomed in about half an hour ago. Have you discussed the finances of legalizing marijuana, the tax gained and the lessees, police, courts, etc.? Has been a valuable argument in favor of legalization.
I didn't catch all of that, but finances and I guess like sort of taxing and that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
and it is, like I said, it is a strong argument, and that's why you know, when I talked about what should the goals be, you know, that is a strong one. It shouldn't be the only one. We shouldn't legalize cannabis just because we can make loads of tax and loads of money off it, right? Because also it's like, who's that money going to and what's being done with it? But if we can set it up in a way where we're taxing it appropriately, because, you know, we also don't want to tax it too much. We want to be competitive, you know, with the black market and things like that. So you've got to think about that a little bit. But that, you know, in some states, although the money's not strangely sort of being invested directly into kind of drug policy and harm reduction, it's going into schools and things like that. So that really needs to be written into the legislative model, I would say, beforehand. But it's a huge bonus. The fact that this can be a legitimate industry, and we know that the reason why a number of countries are, you know, like I said, not talking about when, not talking about if, sorry, but how, what model we got, is because, you know, we're just coming out of a national pandemic, and, you know, legalizing cannabis is going to be a nice economy boost. Shouldn't be the only reason that we legalize, but it is a good one. So, you know, pick and choose.
amazing. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody who's still here. I know it's a bit late now, but yeah, and we all want to go and eat our dinner. But yeah, thank you so much, Amber. It was a really great talk. I've learned a lot, and I think I've just seen in our group chat that we are currently planning our templates to send to our MPs.
What I will add is, if you send a letter to your MP, especially if you cite any of sort of our reports and stuff, or just generally, do copy us in and send us a copy, because that's the kind of thing where if we end up speaking to them, we can say, oh, but your constituent, you received a letter from them. Yeah, so we love to see that if you do send one, and we're always happy to kind of maybe try and follow up if we can as well.
Yeah, and add an extra bit of pressure as well. Great. Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Amber.
Thanks, everyone.